So we are now entering the respiratory system unit. Specifically, we're going to be talking this week about the anatomy. So just the structures, where they are, and touching light on their specific functions, but mostly just memorizing where these structures are and how they all work together. So before we get into the structures, I wanted to give you guys an introduction into the function. So the major function of all the respiratory system is to supply the body with oxygen and dispose of the carbon dioxide that's given off by your cells during cellular respiration. Trillion of cells depend on oxygen. Cells will take up oxygen and give off carbon dioxide and rid itself of waste products. All of this that I'm talking about is in cellular respiration. It's how your cells gain energy. They take what you consume, as in glucose, and they use it for cells' energy. Oxygen and CO2 are also a big part of that. So process to accomplish function, and this is more, we'll go way more into this next week, but you have something called ventilation. When you think of ventilation, you're thinking of breathing. So the movement of air into and out of the lungs so that gases are continuously changing and refreshed. So it's just that movement in and out of the lungs. Gas exchange, you have external gas exchange. That would be movement of oxygen from the lungs to the blood and of CO2 from the blood to the lungs. So that's pretty much just getting, we're in the lungs. So the exchange at the lungs. Internal respiration would be within the tissues in the blood. So now we're like internal. So external respiration is within the exchange within the lungs, and internal respiration is the exchange within tissues. And the third process, so there's three processes: ventilation, which is just breathing; gas exchange, which is the specific gas exchange between either the lungs or tissues; and then gas transport, so how it's moving from the tissues to your lungs and then out the body. So we're looking closer at your hemoglobin and how it's moving through the body. So these processes will go much more in depth next week, but just as a quick summary. Okay, so let's get into the structures and our functions. So the first one is our nose. The nose provides airway for respiration, moistens and warms entering air. We want it to be a certain temperature, otherwise your body will be out of homeostasis. Filters and cleans inspired air as well. You have bacteria that's in there. Serves as a chamber for speech. Houses the olfactory receptor, so it has to do with smell, which is going more into digestion, but it also has that function here. Okay, so those are your 5 functions of the nose. So structures. The biggest thing about the nose to understand is your only external and visible part of the respiratory system. So when you look at each other, you can actually see a structure or a organ of the respiratory system, and that is the nose. Now we're going to enter inside the body. So now we're in the nasal cavity. And just as a pause, all these structures I kind of put in order, like as a molecule would travel into the body. So it would start with the nose, and now it's in the nasal cavity. It's posterior to the external nose. It's the main route for air to and from the lungs. It's lined with sticky mucus that traps dust particles and germs. During breathing, air enters the cavity by passing through the nostrils. You do have a septum, a nasal septum, that divides the 2 cavities of the nose. You also have these mucus-lined cavities called sinuses, and in there are it's mucus, just to make sure that there's white blood cells in there, just making sure that there are no issues with an infection. So these are all kind of the structures of that nasal area. So just look at some sinuses. There are 4 main sinuses. You have the frontal sinus, which is a depression in the frontal lobe; the ethmoidal sinus, which is a depression in the ethmoid bone; sphenoidal sinus, which is a larger one in the sphenoid; and the maxillary sinus, which is a depression in the sinus. So these are all little pockets, or I'm sorry, maxillary bone. These are all pockets filled with mucus. It wouldn't be much unless there was an infection, and then of course you have a sinus infection or something, you would fill with more mucus. So just to kind of see the nasal cavity and how it all works together. Okay, so now we're going to be in the throat. So we were just in the green structure, the nasal cavity. Now we're going to be back behind that, and now we're in the pharynx. So think of the pharynx as your throat. Your throat, it goes from the nose down into the close to your larynx. So all of this blue, purple, and this like turquoise region is all parts of the pharynx. So there are three structures you need to know when you're learning about the pharynx. The pharynx connects the nasal cavity and mouth, and it will take it down essentially to the correct tube, quote unquote, in a moment. So the structures. The first structures is your nasopharynx. Your nasopharynx, nasal, it's behind your nose. So it's posterior to the nasal cavity and most superior. Of course, hopefully, air only. All of us have like this funny, like you're laughing and you're drinking milk and it goes out the wrong way and it goes out your nose, but usually there should be no food or fluid in the nasopharynx. If it does, it doesn't feel so good. So nasopharynx is the part of the pharynx behind the nose. Right below that, more inferior, is the oropharynx. Oro means mouth, so it's right behind your mouth. So now these are not just passageways for air, but also for food. Laryngopharynx is the most inferior, and it is an air and food passage, and it's right above the epiglottis. So these three structures these two and three, those structures could be also, we're going to learn about them when we learn about digestion, because they can technically be for food. But now, after this, we're going to get strictly into the respiratory. Okay, so nasopharynx, behind the nose, oropharynx, mouth, laryngopharynx is now like getting most inferior, right below that. So another picture, nasal cavity, nasopharynx, see behind the nose, oropharynx, now it's food and air, and laryngopharynx, food and air. And then the nasopharynx is the only one that should only be gas. Okay, so now we are, and like I said, I put these like we're going into the motion, or going like your oxygen coming in. So routes air and food into proper channels and also plays a role in your speech. So we are going to now be entering your trachea. So this is, you have two quote unquote tubes. You have the esophagus. Your esophagus would go to your stomach, and that's for food. And then you've got the trachea, which is like your voice box, right? So that's going to be like, or I'm sorry, this is where for your, this is the tube that will go to your oxygen or to your lungs. Okay, so structures made of many cartilage structures. So you have the thyroid cartilage. That's the first one. So what you can literally take, and you'll see this with the rabbit, you can take this structure out and it would take out all these structures. You have to look inside. So it's the largest of all cartilage and is formed in the fusion of two plates. This is what you see in males for the Adam's apple. Then you have the epiglottis. The epiglottis is a flap, essentially, that is making sure that food doesn't go down the wrong pipe, right? You ever heard that? Like, it went down the wrong pipe and you start choking. The epiglottis is there to make sure that nothing is going down the trachea and things are going down the right way, which would be like your esophagus. So when you're not swallowing, it doesn't restrict air passage, but when you swallow, it puts a lid over the trachea so food doesn't go into the lungs. Sometimes that can happen, especially with little kids, and you might have to do the Heimlich remover or something to try to get it out, but that's choking, essentially, is when the epiglottis doesn't work correctly, or you're eating too fast, or something's too big, and it goes into the trachea. Vocal cords, it's a slit in this region that vibrates, and it makes noises. The slit itself is called the glottis. So you can kind of see here what everything looks like. You've got the epiglottis, that'd be like the flap. So imagine like right now, like as you're talking or whatever, you're not eating, like this is fine. But when you swallow, it would close. So it would just close this off so that food does not go down this region. So this is the epiglottis. This is like the vocal cords, and it vibrates when you are speaking. Okay, so now we're to the trachea. So this is what the thyroid cartilage looks like. So when we were just talking about it, we were looking at it from above. So we like took out the pipe, essentially. We took out the trachea, and we looked in the superior motion of it, and that's what you would see. You would see that slit. But this is from the outside. This is your thyroid cartilage, and this is your trachea. And these are all like little rings of hyaline cartilage. Very important. Make sure you know that's hyaline. Travels from the larynx to the fifth vertical vertebrae. So this is your part of your larynx. So it goes from here all the way down to about the fifth vertebrae, thoracic vertebrae. The reason why you have these C-shaped rings is it keeps the shape no matter how, like if you went for a crazy intense run or you're breathing really heavily for whatever reason, that the trachea doesn't essentially bust. You don't want that. You want to be able to breathe as deeply as you want without damaging that structure. Okay, so now we are further down. So the trachea will now divide into two branches, and those are called bronchi. You have a left and a right one. Your right bronchi is wider and shorter, which I'll kind of explain in a minute. It has to do with your heart. Your heart's there, right? So your heart's like a little bit to that structure. So you have the primary bronchi. It says bronchus if it's just like one, like this one. So you have the primary bronchi. The primary bronchi will then branch to the secondary bronchi, will then branch to the tertiary bronchi, and then the smallest would be like the bronchioles. So it's almost like a tree, I guess. Like you have like your main branch, and then you have like, or the trunk, I should say, and then your branches. Okay, so you have the trachea to the primary bronchi, to the secondary, to the tertiary, to the bronchioles. At the very end of that, you have these little sacs, and this is where gas exchange occurs, and they're called the alveoli. The alveoli, you have more than 300 million alveoli in both your lungs, and it's a huge surface area for gas exchange. They kind of look like grapes when you look at them, and they're covered in capillaries. So this is where like all your gas exchange would occur. It's where your oxygenated blood would come in, deoxygenated blood would come out, type of deal. Smooth muscle tissue in the walls help regulate and carry out from the trachea to the lungs. So inside of there, you just have some smooth muscle that is constantly contracting in all these structures, making things move. Okay, so the lungs, you have two lungs that differ slightly in shape and size because the apex of the heart is slightly to the left. Your left lung is smaller and subdivided into superior and inferior lobes. The right lobe, which is larger, and subdivided into superior, middle, and inferior lobes. So the left lung only has superior and inferior lobes. The right lobe has three, superior, middle, and inferior. The top of the lung is called the apex, and the bottom, or the most inferior, is called the base. I'll get to the pleura in a minute, so if I go too fast, that's okay. So again, your two lungs. So just so you can kind of see, so your heart is a little bit to the left, which causes there to be a little bit of a shorter on the right, compared to the left, because you have like a little bit, like I said, the heart is just like a little bit more this way. So imagine your heart is here. Your left lung only has superior and inferior lobes. Your right lung has superior, middle, and inferior. You have the base, and you also have the apex. Okay, so the pleura, that's what I kind of sped through, but that's because it's on this slide too. Two membranes, so we're looking at the very outside of the lung. You have two membranes that cover each lung. They're separate from each other by a very thin layer of lubricating fluid. It allows them to slide easily during breathing. So you have the parietal, which is outer, visceral, which is inner, so because there's two membranes, so the outer membrane is the parietal, the inner is the visceral, and then in between that space in between is called the cavity, the pleural cavity. So this is what it looks like, right? So there's your lung. You have the parietal, which is outside, the blue line. The green line would be visceral, and that white space would just be the cavity. That's where fluid is. The last structure is your diaphragm. The diaphragm doesn't actually carry or exchange gas, but it does have to do with increasing or decreasing the volume of the thoracic cavity, which is huge in the function, which we'll learn next week. It's a very thin muscle, so it's skeletal muscle that separates the thoracic cavity from digestion. When you contract this muscle, it will go downward or inferior, increasing the volume, and therefore making oxygen have to come in, right? Because gas always goes from high to low pressure. And then it will also go up, decreasing the volume, and therefore increasing the pressure and causing the gases to go from high to low and then out. But again, that's Boyle's law. We'll talk more about that next week. So those are all the structures. You are also doing another activity with the visible body, so you should have seen it inside as well. I only left it with the more superior or upper respiratory structures, so some of these may have been new. But yeah, we'll spend the next 2 days practicing, and then next week we'll get into the functions. Okay, see you soon.